A Soviet prisoner begged a German soldier for help, but then the unthinkable happened. I am chained to the ice. I am dying slowly. The German soldiers watch from a distance, as if I were part of an experiment they have seen dozens of times before. The cold no longer hurts. That was the most terrible part. When the body stops suffering, it means that it has already left you. My lips were purple. My skin was blue. My fingers were hard as stone. I knew it would be my last day. And then, in the middle of that white and silent hell, a man approached me. He shouldn't have done that. No soldier should have done what he did, but he did. And that's why I'm still alive today, at 88 years old, to tell this story. My name is Elena Volkova. I am 88 years old. I live in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of Novosibirsk in Siberia, far from the place where I was born, and even farther from the place where I died and was reborn that winter. I have spent over 60 years forgetting what happened. In the Soviet Union, we didn't talk about captivity. We didn't talk about camps. Those who survived the Germans often ended up in other camps, even in our own country. We were considered traitors simply for having survived. That's why I remained silent. I married, worked in a factory, raised my sons, and grew old in silence. I learned to conceal my past so deeply that sometimes I began to believe it had never happened. But the truth is, you don't forget the day you were chosen to die. You carry that day inside you, like a splinter under your skin that no one sees, but that never stops stinging. Today, now that my country no longer exists, now that the fear of the KGB has disappeared, I have agreed to tell my story. Not for the sake of heroism. We weren't heroes, we were victims. I tell this story because some stories have to survive, even if they hurt. I was 22 years old when they took me away. It was January 1942. The war had already come to our house. We lived in a small village near Minsk in Belarus. That winter was cruel, one of the most bitter the old people could remember. Snow covered everything, the roads disappeared, and the frost cut into flesh like a sharp knife. I lived with my mother and my younger sister, Tanya, in a wooden house. My father and my brothers had gone to the front in the first days of the war. We knew nothing about them. Perhaps they had already fallen near Moscow. Perhaps they were surrounded. We were left alone. There was almost no food left. We cooked soup from potato peels and old bark to somehow trick our stomachs. But the worst thing wasn't the hunger. The most terrible thing was the fear. The Germans were everywhere. They occupied our village quickly, sweeping through like a steel storm. At first, we thought if we sat still, they wouldn't touch us. But to them, we weren't human beings. We were labor, livestock, objects. They knocked on the door before dawn. 3 soldiers, gray coats, helmets, faces wrapped in scarves against the cold. They didn't shout. They spoke calmly, businesslike, and that made it even frightening. Mama tried to stand in front of us to shield us, but one of the soldiers simply shoved us aside with the butt of his rifle like a sack of rags. She hit the stove and fell. Tanya screamed. I'm frozen. Everything inside me cold. I realized this was the end. They explained nothing, just a hand gesture. You and you. They chose me and a few other girls from the neighboring houses. They threw us out onto the street, into the cold, without even letting us put on warm clothes. I only managed to grab an old scarf and my mother's coat, which was hanging on the door. Mom crawled after us through the snow, grabbed the soldier by his boots, begged and cried. The soldier hit her again. I saw her lying there in the white snow, a small black speck that grew smaller and smaller as the truck took us away. I didn't have time to say goodbye. I didn't have time to hug her. I didn't even know then that I would never see her again. If you're hearing this story now in a warm place, you know that what I'm about to tell you is hard to imagine, but every word is true. We were shoved into the truck like firewood. There were already other women there, all young, all terrified. We traveled for a long time, hours, maybe days. We didn't know where they were taking us. Someone whispered that they were taking us to work on farms in Germany. Someone said they were going to shoot us, but the reality turned out to be worse. We were taken to the train station. There was a long train, cattle cars. It was a sea of people, thousands of women, children, old people, barking dogs, shouts in German, crying children, all merging into a terrible din. They beat us with rifle butts and shoved us so tightly into the cars that it was impossible to raise a hand. The doors closed with a heavy bang and darkness fell. It was dark and cold in the carriage. An icy wind penetrated through the cracks in the boards. There were so many of us that we could only stand crammed together. There wasn't enough air. It smelled of fear, sweat, and urine. The train started moving, and our journey into hell began. We traveled for many days. I lost all sense of time, maybe a week, maybe 2. They gave us almost no water. There was no food at all. Sometimes, during stopovers, the doors were opened and a bucket of dirty water or a few pieces of frozen bread were thrown in. Women fought over these crumbs and lost their human form from hunger. But many could no longer fight. People died right there, standing up. They had nowhere to fall over. The dead stood next to the living, swaying to the rhythm of the train's movement. I remember the woman next to me. She was holding a small child in her arms. The baby cried for the first 2 days, then it fell silent. On the 3rd day, I realized he had died, but my mother continued to hold him to her chest, warming him with her heat and whispering lullabies. When we were finally released, she refused to let go of the body. The soldiers forcibly snatched it from her and threw it into a pile in the snow. I still hear that mother's scream in my nightmares. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, many people simply fell out like sacks. Those who were still alive could barely move. I couldn't feel my legs. I was dehydrated, hungry, exhausted, but I was young. I wanted to live. We were greeted by German shepherds and shouts of "Schnell, schnell." That was the first word we learned. We were driven through the snow and through gates topped with barbed wire. The camp. It was a huge field filled with wooden barracks, turrets with machine guns, searchlights, smoke from chimneys, and a smell, a sweetish, nauseating smell that permeated everything around us. At first, I didn't understand what it was. Later, they explained to me it was the smell of burning corpses. They took us into a large, cold building and ordered us to undress completely. The shame was unbearable, but the fear was stronger. The women wept and tried to cover themselves with their hands. The Germans walked among us, laughing and pointing at us as if they were selecting goods at a market. Then they shaved us. Rough hands cut off our hair with clippers, our braids, our pride. I watched as my light brown hair fell onto the dirty concrete floor, and I felt my former life fall with it. Elena Volkova from the village near Minsk disappeared. All that remained was a body, a naked, trembling, nameless body. They gave us clothes. They weren't warm clothes, but rags, thin, striped dresses, wooden clogs instead of proper shoes. No underwear, no coats. We had to survive the cold in them. And they gave us numbers. I am no longer Elena. I became number 4582. This number wasn't tattooed. It was sewn on a dress, but it burned itself into my memory as deeply as a tattoo.